Big Shaq walked into a luxury store, expecting to browse. But then a security guard sneered, "You can't afford anything in here." The room went silent. Customers exchanged stunned glances. The tension thick in the air, and even the employees paused to watch. But instead of getting angry, Shaq just smiled, because he had a plan. What happened next shattered the guard's career, flipped the entire store upside down, and left the CEO kneeling before him. Stay till the end. This story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Sir, I think you are in the wrong store. The voice carried an unmistakable edge, a tone drenched in arrogance and authority. It belonged to Rick Donovan, the head of security at Levant's Luxe, an ultra-exclusive luxury boutique where only the wealthiest clientele were welcomed with open arms. Rick stepped forward, planting himself directly in front of the entrance, blocking the path like a bouncer at an elite club. His stance was firm, his shoulders squared, as if he were preparing for a confrontation. On the other side of this invisible barrier stood Shaquille O'Neal, towering over him with an air of quiet confidence. Shaq had stepped into the store casually, wearing a comfortable hoodie, fitted jeans, and a pair of sleek sneakers. He wasn't dressed in a designer suit, nor did he carry himself with the pretentious attitude of the usual customers who waltzed through those doors. And that was enough for Rick to assume the worst. "I said," Rick repeated louder this time, making sure the nearby shoppers heard him, "You're in the wrong place, pal." The murmur of conversation among the customers quieted as several heads turned in their direction. Curious eyes flicked toward the scene unfolding near the entrance. A few well-dressed men in tailored suits paused their shopping, while women in elegant dresses exchanged knowing glances. Shaq tilted his head slightly, watching Rick with an unreadable expression. He had dealt with people like this before, people who judged others based on appearances, who thought power came from standing behind a uniform or an expensive storefront. "Is that right?" Shaq's voice was calm, deep, and unbothered. Rick scoffed. "Yeah, that's right. Levant's Luxe is for elite clients, people who can actually afford to be here." His lips curled into a smug grin as he took in Shaq's casual attire. "This isn't some discount sneaker shop. Why don't you try across the street?" A soft chuckle rippled through the store. One man near the glass display case smirked and whispered something to his friend. And a woman near the perfume section raised an eyebrow, watching with veiled amusement. Shaq remained still, his massive frame unmoving, unreadable. He exhaled slowly, a quiet patience lingering in his gaze. Then he took a step forward, and Rick shoved him. The impact wasn't enough to move Shaq much, but it sent a shockwave through the store. A loud collective gasp echoed through the boutique. A woman clutched her handbag tighter. A man pulled out his phone, his fingers moving swiftly to record. Rick, oblivious to the tension in the room, grinned. He thought he had won. "You don't listen too well, do you?" he sneered, stepping forward again. "Now how about you walk yourself out before I have to make you?" For the first time, Shaq smirked. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the boutique. A store manager, pale-faced and frantic, rushed toward them. Rick barely noticed. He still thought he was in control. Lisa Hart had been managing Levant's Luxe for nearly a decade, and in that time, she had dealt with difficult customers, VIP clients, and even the occasional celebrity. But never in her career had she felt the kind of dread that hit her as she rushed toward the entrance. Heart pounding, palms sweating, her heels clicked against the marble floor as she pushed through a small crowd of onlookers. And then she saw him, Shaquille O'Neal. Lisa turned pale, her breath caught in her throat. She had watched this man dominate the NBA for years. She had seen his face on countless business ventures, commercials, endorsements. He was worth hundreds of millions, and Rick Donovan, her security guard, had just put his hands on him. "Oh my God!" Lisa's voice came out as a whisper before she snapped into action. She shoved past Rick, stepping between him and Shaq, eyes wide with panic. "Mr. O'Neal, I am so sorry," she blurted out, her voice trembling. Shaq didn't speak. He simply arched an eyebrow, watching her reaction. Rick, however, let out a loud, dismissive laugh. "Oh, come on, Lisa," he scoffed, waving a hand. "You can't be serious. This guy?" He jabbed a thumb toward Shaq. "He ain't Shaquille O'Neal. He's just some wannabe athlete who thought he could wander in here and—" "Are you out of your mind?" Lisa snapped, rounding on him so fast that Rick actually took a step back. Lisa gestured wildly toward Shaq. Do you not know who this is? Rick's smirk faltered slightly. A few customers in the store started whispering, their eyes darting between him and Shaq. A woman near the perfume counter was already recording. Lisa turned back to Shaq, her voice almost pleading now. Mr. O'Neill, please. I... This is a complete misunderstanding. Please don't sue the store. We... we can fix this. Shaq finally moved. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. The moment it appeared, Lisa's breath hitched. Rick, still oblivious, crossed his arms. Oh, what? You gonna call your buddies? But Lisa knew better. That phone call was about to change everything. Shaq's massive fingers moved deliberately over his phone screen, his expression unreadable. The weight of the moment settled over the boutique, pressing down like an approaching storm. Lisa swallowed hard, her hands twisting nervously as she glanced between Shaq and Rick. She had been around enough power players to know when the game had changed, and right now, Shaq was in full control. Rick, however, still didn't get it. He let out a snort, crossing his arms over his chest. Oh, what now? You calling your lawyer? His voice was dripping with mockery, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes now. Shaq didn't even look at him. He pressed a button and lifted the phone to his ear. Let's see what your boss thinks about this, he said coolly. The words sent a ripple of tension through the store. Lisa's face drained of color. A younger employee, a sales associate barely out of college, let out a sharp inhale. He turned to the coworker beside him, eyes wide. Dude, he's worth over $400 million. Rick's cocky stance stiffened. A thin bead of sweat formed at his temple, but he still tried to act unbothered. The ringing stopped. Then a voice answered. Deep, authoritative, and immediately recognizable. Daniel Whitmore. Lisa almost fainted. The Daniel Whitmore, CEO of Levance Lux. The man who built the company from the ground up. A billionaire whose mere presence could make or break careers. And Shaq was calling him like an old friend. D, what's up, my guy? Shaq greeted casually, but his tone carried an edge. There was a brief pause. Then Daniel's voice sharpened. Shaq? You never call me during the day. What's going on? Shaq glanced at Rick, his smirk barely noticeable. I'm standing in your store right now, and your security guard just put his hands on me. Dead. Silence. Lisa inhaled sharply. Rick's fingers twitched slightly. Then, Daniel's voice boomed through the speakerphone, loud enough for the entire store to hear. Put that security guard on the line. Now. Rick's face turned ghost white. For the first time, real fear crept into his expression. Rick's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the phone, his usual smug confidence nowhere to be seen. His palms felt damp, and despite his best efforts to steady his breathing, his chest tightened with every second that passed. The weight of 100 eyes bore down on him, waiting, judging. He forced a nervous chuckle, gripping the phone tightly. Sir, this isn't what it looks like, he said, his voice lacking the arrogance it held just moments ago. A long silence stretched on the other end of the line. Then Daniel Whitmore's voice came through, sharp and deadly calm. You laid hands on Shaquille O'Neal? Rick swallowed hard. He could feel his pulse hammering in his throat. His eyes darted around the store, searching for some kind of support, but there was none. Lisa stood rigid, arms crossed, eyes burning with unfiltered rage. The customers who had once been entertained by his behavior now watched with a mix of curiosity and quiet disapproval. Rick cleared his throat, his forced grin twitching at the corners. Sir, I wouldn't say that exactly, he stammered. It was just a misunderstanding. The guy walked in looking... Like what, Rick? Daniel's voice had lowered, but somehow it carried even more weight. Rick hesitated. He knew he had just stepped onto thin ice. His usual excuses, the ones that worked on customers he had bullied in the past, were useless now. I was just following protocol, he tried again, his words weaker this time. You know, making sure the right kind of clientele... The right kind of clientele? Daniel repeated, and this time there was no mistaking the disgust in his tone. Let me get this straight. You shoved one of the most famous athletes in the world, who, by the way, could buy this store 10 times over, because you assumed he wasn't the right kind of clientele? Rick opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. The room felt suffocating now. The polished marble floors and bright showroom lights, once a stage for his dominance, had turned into a spotlight exposing his worst mistake. Sir, please, Enough, Daniel snapped, cutting him off. I've heard enough. The finality in his voice sent a chill down Rick's spine. His stomach lurched. He had never heard Daniel sound this angry before. Sir, I'm coming down there. Now. The line went dead with a sharp click. Rick stood motionless, the color draining from his face as the weight of what just happened fully sank in. The realization hit like a truck. His career was hanging by a thread, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For a long, tense moment, Rick stood frozen, his mind racing for a way out. The walls of Levant's Lux, once a place where he held authority, now felt like they were closing in on him. Then a grin, small at first, then widening, spread across his face. He straightened his posture, squared his shoulders, and let out a dramatic sigh. Actually, he began, his voice suddenly filled with confidence. He turned to Lisa, the customers, and anyone still watching. Shaq attacked me first. The store fell into stunned silence. Lisa's jaw dropped. She took a step back, eyes wide with disbelief. What? She blurted out, her voice sharp. That's a lie. I was standing right here. Rick shrugged, unfazed. Oh, come on, Lisa, he said smoothly, his smirk growing. You saw it. He got aggressive with me. I was just doing my job, keeping the store safe. That's why I had to push him back. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Customers exchanged hesitant glances, unsure what to believe. Rick could feel the tide shifting. Just a little, but enough. I mean, look at him, he continued, motioning toward Shaq. Dude's, what, 7 feet tall? I had to defend myself. He was acting threatening. Shaq, who had been silent this entire time, finally moved. He let out a slow, deep chuckle. It wasn't forced. It wasn't nervous. It was the laugh of a man who had already won. Rick's smirk faltered, just slightly. Shaq calmly raised his massive hand and pointed to the corner of the store. All eyes followed. There it was. A small, barely noticeable security camera, perched above a sleek glass display case, its tiny red light blinking steadily. Shaq turned back to Rick, his expression still calm, unbothered. You sure about that story? He asked. Rick's throat went dry. Lisa, snapping out of her shock, immediately turned to the front counter. Wait, she said, her voice rising. Are the cameras on? A beat of silence passed. Rick's fake confidence cracked as the truth loomed over him. If the cameras were recording, his lie wouldn't just fail, it would destroy him. Shaq stood tall, his massive arms crossing over his chest as he leveled his gaze at Rick. His voice was calm but firm, carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. Roll the footage. The words sent a jolt of electricity through the store. The tension in the air thickened as every pair of eyes turned toward Lisa, who stood frozen for a second before snapping into action. She spun around toward the cashier counter, where a young employee was already scrambling for the store's security system. Pull up the last 10 minutes, Lisa ordered, her voice clipped. Now! Rick let out a nervous laugh, but it lacked the arrogance he had just moments ago. Oh, come on, he scoffed, trying to keep his tone light. This is ridiculous. We don't need to. Lisa shot him a glare so sharp it could cut glass. You have one more second to shut up, Rick. The young employee hesitated for a moment before clicking a few keys on the monitor. A large screen behind the register flickered to life. The crisp, high-definition footage from the security cameras lit up for everyone to see. The store fell completely silent. On the screen, the events from earlier unfolded in stark detail. The footage showed Shaq entering the store, walking in calmly, only to be immediately confronted by Rick. The audio played through the speakers, making every insult, every arrogant remark from Rick painfully clear. Then came the moment that made everyone's breath catch. Rick, with his signature, smug expression, shoved Shaq. The scene played out in perfect clarity. Shaq hadn't raised a hand, hadn't spoken aggressively. It was all Rick. A collective gasp rippled through the boutique. Some customers exchanged shocked glances. Others shook their heads in disgust. Rick's smirk, gone. His face drained of color as the undeniable evidence played on repeat. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His body was rigid, hands clenched at his sides as if he were trying to physically hold on to the lie he had just told. Lisa took a slow step toward him, her lips pressed into a thin line. So, she said coolly, do you want to try lying again? Rick didn't respond. He couldn't. The screech of tires pierced the silence. A black limousine came to a sharp stop outside the store. Daniel Whitmore had arrived. The doors to Levant's Lux burst open with a force that sent a shockwave through the store. Daniel Whitmore, the CEO himself, stormed inside, his face dark with fury. His tailored navy suit was immaculate, but the way he moved, fast, sharp, no nonsense, made it clear that he hadn't come for pleasantries. His gaze locked onto Rick like a predator spotting its prey. "You! Office!" Now Rick flinched, his body going rigid as all eyes in the store snapped to him. For the first time since this disaster started, he looked truly afraid. Daniel didn't wait for a response. His polished dress shoes clicked against the marble floor as he strode toward the counter where Lisa stood, arms crossed. His voice was clipped, furious, controlled in a way that somehow made it even more terrifying. "Lisa," he said, "I saw the footage on my way here." His jaw clenched. "Tell me every single detail." Lisa nodded, barely taking a breath before launching into the full explanation. How Shaq had walked in peacefully, how Rick mocked him, shoved him, and then had the audacity to lie about it. Daniel's nostrils flared. "So let me get this straight." He turned back to Rick, who looked like he wanted to disappear. "You put your hands on Shaquille O'Neal, a VIP client, a friend of mine, and one of the most recognizable figures in the world?" Rick opened his mouth, but no words came out. Daniel took a slow, menacing step toward him. "And then you tried to lie about it? On camera?" The air in the store was electric. Customers held their breath. A few had their phones out, recording every second of what was quickly becoming the most satisfying downfall they had ever witnessed. Daniel exhaled sharply, then pointed directly at Rick. "You're fired, effective immediately." A burst of applause erupted from the customers. Some even cheered. Lisa let out an exhale of relief. Even Shaq, who had remained mostly silent, gave a slow nod of approval. Rick, however, didn't move. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his face blank, his eyes darting between Daniel, Lisa, and Shaq. Then slowly, his lips curled into a smirk. "Actually," Rick said, straightening his posture. His voice was suddenly steady, his fear replaced with something else, something smug. "You can't fire me?" Lisa's head snapped toward him. What did he mean? The moment they thought this nightmare was over, Rick had just thrown in an unexpected twist. Rick's smirk widened as he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone like a magician revealing his trump card. "You think you can just fire me?" he sneered, shaking his head. "Nah, I have friends in high places." A murmur rippled through the store. Lisa's eyes narrowed, arms crossing over her chest, while Daniel remained unfazed, standing tall with his hands in his pockets. Shaq, leaning slightly against the counter, arched an eyebrow, but said nothing. Rick dialed a number, pressing the speakerphone button. The ringing filled the silent store. Within seconds, a deep, authoritative voice answered. "This is Gregory Vaughn." Rick's grin stretched. "Greg, it's me, Rick. We've got a situation here at Levance Lux." He shot Daniel a sideways glance before continuing. "The CEO just tried to fire me, but I was following company policy." Daniel's lips barely twitched. He let him talk. Rick pressed forward. "Some guy came in acting suspicious, and I did my job. But now because he's famous, I'm the bad guy? That's not how we operate, right?" The audience held their breath. Some customers whispered among themselves, wondering if Rick had a legitimate way out. Gregory Vaughn let out a sigh. "Rick, what exactly did you do?" Rick's expression didn't change. "Just standard protocol, Greg. I stopped a guy who looked like he didn't belong, and he overreacted. That's all." Shaq chuckled. It was quiet, but it cut through the room like a knife. Rick ignored it. "Listen, I know you have my back. Just let Daniel know I was right, and we can move on from this." Silence. Then, Gregory's voice returned, but this time it was low, hesitant. "Rick, did you even check the security footage?" Rick stiffened. His fingers twitched around his phone. "That doesn't matter. You know how these things go, man. You and I have always looked out for each other." Gregory exhaled heavily. "Yeah, well, that's not going to work this time." Rick's smirk vanished. "What?" Daniel finally stepped forward. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a crisp document, and held it up for Rick to see. "Really, Rick?" he said smoothly. "You want to play that game?" He turned the paper slightly, revealing bold letters at the top. "Termination contract." Rick's face drained of color. Daniel's expression was ice cold. "You don't work here anymore, and your friend just resigned." Rick stumbled back, stunned. The one person he counted on had just abandoned him. He had no way out. Rick stood motionless, his mouth slightly open, his mind scrambling for a response. His one lifeline, Gregory Vaughn, had just abandoned him. The smug confidence he had clung to was gone, leaving nothing but raw panic. Shaq, however, was completely unfazed. His towering frame remained relaxed, his arms crossed as if he had already seen this moment play out from the beginning. Then, with a slow, knowing smirk, he turned to Daniel. "I think this store needs new leadership." The words weren't loud, but they landed like a thunderclap in the dead-silent boutique. Daniel's sharp gaze flicked to Shaq, and for a moment he simply studied him, his mind working behind calculating eyes. Then slowly, he nodded. "You want in?" Rick's head snapped up, his stomach twisted. "Wait, what?" Shaq shrugged casually, as if they were discussing a minor investment and not a massive power shift. "Depends," he said smoothly. "You looking for a partner?" Lisa, who had been watching everything unfold, sucked in a breath. Customers, once simply entertained by Rick's downfall, were now on the edge of their seats. Something big was happening, and they knew it. Rick, however, felt like he was sinking into quicksand. This couldn't be real. This was his job, his authority, his domain. And now, he wasn't just losing his position, he was watching Shaq take over. Daniel folded his arms, nodding slightly. "We should talk in private." Shaq motioned toward the back offices. "Lead the way." Lisa quickly stepped forward to guide them. But as Shaq turned, his gaze landed on Rick, a final, lingering stare that held no malice, no anger. Just quiet amusement. Rick couldn't move. He had lost. The reality sank in as he watched Shaquille O'Neal, the man he had shoved, insulted, and underestimated, walk past him toward the office where real decisions were made. The door shut behind them. A few moments later, Daniel and Shaq emerged, and they shook hands. The deal was done. Everything was about to change. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, the weight of the decision settling over him. The past hour had been a whirlwind, and now sitting across from Shaquille O'Neal, he knew things at Levance Lux would never be the same. This wasn't just a business move. It was a shift in power. Across the polished desk, Shaq remained composed, his large hands resting on the armrests of the leather chair. He had barely spoken in the past few minutes, letting Daniel process the deal on his own. But now as the CEO sat up and reached across the desk, there was no hesitation left in his expression. "It's done." His voice carried the finality of a man who had just sealed a major business decision. He extended his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the power dynamic that had just changed. Shaq's lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. With the confidence of a man who had won long before the game even started, he clasped Daniel's hand in a firm handshake. It wasn't just a gesture of agreement. It was a statement. Lisa stood near the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, still struggling to absorb what had just happened. In all her years managing this store, she had never witnessed a deal of this magnitude unfold right before her eyes. The very idea that Shaq, a man who had walked in as a customer just an hour ago, had now become one of the store's most powerful figures was almost too surreal to believe. Her voice, when it finally came out, was barely above a whisper. "Wait, does that mean—" Daniel turned to her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with a small chuckle, he leaned forward, folding his hands over the desk. "Shaq now owns a major stake in Levance Lux." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She had spent years working under this company, following policies, dealing with entitled clients, handling difficult employees like Rick, and now the very foundation of the store had shifted in an instant. Shaq finally stood, unfolding himself from the chair, his towering figure making the room feel even smaller. His gaze landed on Lisa, assessing her carefully. There was no intimidation in his eyes, no condescension, just a quiet understanding. "You still want to work here?" Lisa blinked, her mind racing. She hadn't even thought about that. Yes, of course, but—" Shaq's smirk deepened slightly as he slid his hands into his pockets. "Good. You're the new manager." Lisa felt her stomach drop as the words sank in. Rick was out. She was in. And just like that, her entire career had changed forever. Rick's breath was shallow, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. The walls of Levance Lux, once a place where he strutted around like he owned it, now felt suffocating. He had lost everything. His job, his authority, his reputation. And the only thing left to do was get out before it got worse. Keeping his head low, he turned toward the exit, hoping to slip away quietly. But just as he took his first step— "Hold up!" Shaq's deep voice cut through the air like a blade. Rick's stomach twisted into knots. and his feet suddenly felt like they were made of lead. He had no choice but to stop. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned back around. The room was dead silent. Every pair of eyes in the store was locked onto him. Customers, employees, even Daniel, the same man who had just fired him. And worst of all, Shaq stood there, completely in control, unfazed, waiting. Rick swallowed hard. What? His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Shaq took a step forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over him. You think you can just walk out after all that? His expression wasn't angry, just disappointed, like a teacher addressing a student who had failed their own test. Rick's jaw tightened. I lost my job. What else do you want? Shaq didn't blink. A public apology. A hush fell over the room. Someone gasped softly. A few customers exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Rick's face flushed red. His pride screamed at him to refuse, to tell Shaq to go to hell and walk out with whatever dignity he had left. But then he saw the phones. Half the store was recording. His humiliation wasn't just happening in this room, it was about to go viral. Rick's throat tightened. His lips pressed into a thin line as he forced himself to speak. And I'm sorry. It came out stiff, barely audible. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Louder. Rick's fist trembled at his sides. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the words out. I'm sorry. A pause. Then, the room erupted. Cheers, applause, laughter. The once intimidated customers now celebrated, clapping as Rick's face burned with humiliation. Rick spun on his heels and stormed out, his head down, while Shaq stood tall, victorious. Shaq stood at the center of Levant's Lux, his massive frame commanding the room, but his expression was calm, satisfied yet reflective. The battle was over. Rick was gone, Lisa had stepped into her new role, and Daniel had just handed over a major stake in the company. But Shaq wasn't done yet. A cluster of customers and employees still lingered, some whispering among themselves, others holding up their phones, capturing the final moments of what had become an unforgettable day. The energy in the room had completely shifted. What started as a display of arrogance and discrimination had transformed into a moment of justice, redemption, and power. Shaq turned to the nearest camera, his deep voice smooth and unwavering. Lesson of the day? Never judge a book by its cover. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lisa, standing near the register, couldn't stop smiling. Just an hour ago, she had been terrified that this entire situation would destroy her store. But now, Shaq had turned it into something bigger than any of them could have imagined. Daniel stepped forward, nodding toward Shaq. You know, he said, crossing his arms, you didn't just buy into the company today, you saved it. Shaq chuckled. Well, now that I'm part owner, I figured it's time for a few changes. Lisa looked up, curious. Like what? Shaq turned to her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then with a casual but powerful certainty, he said, First things first, we're renaming the store. Welcome to O'Neill. Lux, a wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Lisa's mouth fell open. Daniel's eyebrows shot up. Employees glanced at each other, stunned. It wasn't just a name change, it was a statement. Shaq continued, unfazed by the reaction. And another thing, I don't just do business for profit. A portion of the store's earnings will now go to charity, specifically programs that help underprivileged communities get into business. The applause that erupted this time wasn't just polite, it was thunderous. Customers clapped, employees exchanged grateful looks, and Lisa wiped at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed. But the most shocking moment of all came when Daniel Whitmore, billionaire, CEO, took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee before Shaq. The room fell into stunned silence as Daniel bowed his head slightly. Thank you, he said, for saving my brand.